We're about a quarter of a way through the module. We have covered things like defining leadership and what leading is about. We've looked at what leaders look like by looking at some of the qualities and qualifications in 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus 1, and 1 Peter chapter 5. We talked about leading and the heart of leading, the centrality, the priority of our hearts when it comes to leading. Today we're going to be looking at an interesting topic. Are leaders made or are they born? I can remember in high school, in an American history class, a heated debate about whether leaders are born or they're made. We often hear people talking about, well, he's just a natural born leader. In other words, he has the qualities, the gifts, the abilities, and he just fits as a leader. And then there are others who will say, no, it's the situation that causes certain people to rise to the top, to leadership, and if those situations were not present, those would simply be ordinary people. So, which is it? Well, let's check the scriptures and see what they have to say. As we look at these scriptures, what do they have to say about the origin of leaders? In in Psalm 75, verses 6 and 7, it talks about God raising up leaders to accomplish his purposes and his plans. He molds and gifts them. He creates opportunities. He calls them forward. He works with them. A wonderful case in point is in Esther chapter 4, verses 12 through 14, where Esther's uncle, Mordecai, challenges Esther and says, who knows if you weren't born for this particular situation? If you weren't brought forth by God for this time and this place to save your people. And if you don't, God will bring somebody else forward. We see, as we read through Esther, that that is indeed the case. And it is a good question for us to wonder about. Isn't God bringing forth the right people at the right times? Another case in point is Daniel chapter 2, verses 21, where it says that God removes and sets up kings. We know that God equips prophets and kings for his work, so why not leaders as well? How did each of these particular people come to be leaders? Jeremiah, for example, as a prophet and a statesman. In Jeremiah 1, God challenges him and says, I created you to be a prophet. I equipped you. I made you just right for this particular calling. We've already looked at Esther as such a possibility. Consider also someone like Joseph in Genesis 45. Joseph recognized that when he spoke with his brothers after he reveals himself to them. He tells them that it's God who has brought him forth and brought him to Egypt for a time such as this, and therefore he doesn't blame his brothers, and the brothers shouldn't be blaming themselves either. God has been in charge of bringing all of this about. Now, of course, Joseph has had a part in this whole preparation. Joseph has been faithful in doing the little things as a servant in Potiphar's household, as an assistant to the warden in his prison, being faithful to Potiphar and not giving in to temptation, even though Potiphar doesn't know that, at least not initially. Joseph is faithful in the little things. And so he's ready when the opportunity comes forward for leading in a big opportunity. Another case in point is David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 8 through 10. God works in David's life. He calls him, he anoints him to be a king. He works in his life. He uses the little things in David's life. For example, David leads his sheep as a shepherd, and that prepares him for the battle with Goliath later on. Who would have thought that leading sheep would prepare him for a big battle like this? But it does. David learns how to lead a small group of men who gather around him as he runs from Saul. And in doing that, he learns how to guide the entire army of God. In 1 Kings chapter 14, there God says that he even raises up leaders, gives them opportunities even when they fail and when they do evil. God's still working to raise up leaders. We might think, well, okay, God may intervene in key points in history, and he does that with key people in certain situations. But what about in ordinary situations? What about the ordinary leaders in families, in the church, in a neighborhood, in a community? Does God work there also in the same way? What does God say about the origin of leaders in the church? Well, in Romans 12, it says that he gives gifts, and leadership is one of those gifts that he gives. Ephesians 2 mentions the gifts of apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. So leaders are actually gifts that God gives to his church. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 challenges people to realize that the abilities that they have, the spiritual gifts that they have, those are all a gift from God. And if they're a gift from God, then we're not to take credit for them. Leaders are not to boast about what they can do, about the opportunities that they have, about the situations that they seem to excel in. Was that even the case, for example, with Jesus? We're told in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, that God called Jesus to the priesthood. Jesus didn't take that on himself. This was all a preparation of God to accomplish his plan of salvation. So what can we conclude about the origin of leaders and of leadership? I would say that it is all God's doing. He designates leaders, he designs leaders, he equips them, he creates the situations, the opportunities for them to serve, to use their gifts, to rise to the occasion, and then he works in and through them. God even orders the circumstances so that people recognize that here's a man that God is calling to this particular service. Even by chance, we might say. You remember how when Judas committed suicide and the disciples were to choose another man to take his place, they did so by casting of lots. Well, that's chance, right? Things happen by chance. But we are also told that the casting of lots is actually in God's hands. What did Jesus teach his disciples about leadership? And how did he train them to be leaders? In Mark chapter 10, Jesus challenges the disciples not to look at leadership the way the world looks at it, not to want to be leaders, to be ambitious, to rise to the top, to trample over each other. And the disciples were often arguing with each other who was the greatest among them. Jesus uses that example, that most recent argument, to challenge them to say, that's not the way it works in God's kingdom. It works very differently. In Philippians 2, Paul challenges church leaders and says not to be ambitious, but to have a humble attitude, an attitude of putting for others first, an attitude of serving, and then he brings forth Jesus as the example of that. So, if God is even sovereignly choosing and designing his own Son to serve as the leader in salvation and the headship of the church, and if Jesus provides our example in terms of how we are to lead, what should be our attitude about seeking to lead? Is there a contradiction with what Peter says in 1 Peter 5? No, it has all to do with motivation. Are we wanting to be leaders so that we can rise above others and we can say, we can get attention for what we're doing? Or is it that we accept the opportunity to lead because that is a way of serving God? That is what we recognize God is calling us to do. If we've established now that God sovereignly designates and designs leaders, then let's see how he develops those leaders. Obviously, Jesus chose the first leaders of the church when he chose the disciples, the 12. Clearly, he also developed them into leaders through 3 years that they were with him. They got to watch him lead. They got to watch him lead by example. They got to watch him serving them. So how was it that Jesus developed leaders? We can look, for example, at Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus sends his first disciples out 2 by 2. What we see there is that Jesus, from the very beginning, teaches them not to be lone wolves when it comes to being leaders, but to work in teams and in teamwork. The leadership within a church is to be a plurality of leaders, a plurality of elders. And when Jesus sends the disciples out 2 by 2, he puts them in situations that are really impossible in some ways in order that they will trust in him. He equips them to do the work. He challenges them not to be afraid of difficulties. There are going to be some difficult situations. People are going to oppose them. Satan is going to oppose them. But Jesus puts them in those situations so that they would learn to trust in him. How did Jesus develop his followers in Matthew 16? He teaches them how to think for themselves. He asks them, who do people say that he is? And then he asks them, who do they think that Jesus is? He is helping them to begin to think critically and not simply to follow what everybody else is saying. What 2 things does Jesus use to develop leadership in Luke 22 as he challenges Peter about his being faithful to him? He reminds Peter, and really every potential leader, that we're going to fail. We are going to be in situations that are beyond us, and we simply cannot do those things on our own. We're only going to be successful because Christ is interceding for us and praying for us and asking God to equip us and to give us the resources that we need in order to be the leaders that he's called us to be. He puts them in situations where they will have to be stretched and where they will recognize that in their failures, Christ is faithful. What leadership development principle do we learn from Jesus' parable in Matthew 25, the parable of the talents? Obviously, it's to start where we are. What has God given us? What talents? What resources? In order to do the job that is in front of us. And we're to do that. We're to prove faithful with what it is that we have. as the master says to the servants, "Well done, good and faithful servant." We look at Mark chapter 6, verse 7. We see another leadership development principle. And that is to give potential leaders opportunities and what they need in order to be able to succeed. We don't do it for them. We equip them to be leaders. And you who are leaders in this class, you have leaders under you that you're going to be developing. That's the whole point of your getting these materials in your own translation, in your own copy, so that you will turn around and use them to develop leaders within your own church. This isn't just for you. It's for you to keep the process of discipling ongoing. How did Jesus develop leadership with his disciples in John chapter 6? He challenged them to go against the stream. Everybody else was beginning to fall away from Jesus, but he challenges them. What about you? Are you going to leave me too? And he gets them to realize that there are no other options other than following and trusting in the Lord. As we look at the qualifications in 1 Timothy chapter 3, we see the testing ground, the proving ground for leaders. It's in the family. If they can be faithful within the small things, then they can begin to be faithful within the church. How can a man help baby believers grow until he's had an opportunity to help his own babies to grow? How can he discipline and correct unless he first learns to discipline and correct those he loves, his own children? He begins to develop plans small and then grows them as he grows his children, as he grows his wife spiritually. What does 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 2 and 1 Corinthians 11:2 tell us about developing leaders? That first we need to be following somebody else who is following the Lord. This is a whole line of discipleship, a chain of discipleship that should be going on. This has been and will be the great need of the church down through the centuries. People discipling people who are discipling others. Paul says to Timothy, the things you've heard from me, be able to teach others also who will be able to teach others. Right there, there's 4 generations of leadership going on. And that's what we're to be doing, mentoring other leaders. As I said, that's why you're getting the modules printed out for you so that you can take them back to your own churches and train your people there. So, are leaders made or are they born? The answer is yes. They're made by God through all kinds of situations, but they're also born to lead as God designs and designates them to those particular opportunities. They come forward because God draws them forward, encourages them to come forward, equips them to come forward. I wonder now, do you see things in your own life that are God's hand, gifts He's given, opportunities He's given you, other people He's put in your life who are discipling you so that you might be able to disciple others? Are you developing certain strengths that God has begun to give to you? And can you see situations where you could be serving the church? Are others confirming this in your life? Are they looking to you for leadership? Are they asking you to disciple them? Are they wanting to learn from you? Are they eager to hear what you have to say? Where do you desire to be better developed as a leader? How can this module help you to grow in your leadership? What do you need to take to heart and practice? Are there certain areas where you see weaknesses and you need to begin to build those weaknesses up even more? Do you see others around you who might be leaders? I hope as we're going through this class, you're thinking, I could be doing this with so-and-so. I could be training so-and-so on this. I could be passing this on to someone else. They would really grow with this. They would rise to the occasion. I hope you're thinking of men that you can train when you go home to your particular class, your particular churches after this class. How can you help specifically to develop their leadership? And where do you need to be praying that God will use you to work with them? Here is a wonderful opportunity to grow your church by growing yourself and growing the leaders that God has given you. If God has given you a group of believers to work with, He has given you some leaders within that group. It's not meant for you to be the only leader. Begin to develop a plurality of leadership within your group, within your church, and walk with them in this whole process of discipling. Grow with them in that process. We will have another module developed in the future on discipleship, how we ourselves are discipled and how we are to disciple others. But that's another module. We're going to be moving on now to a new set of lessons next time. Leaders working within teams. Biblical leadership is teamwork. And we're going to be talking about that in our next lesson. Thank you. We'll see you then.